Let me just describe what I think was going on when the legislature opened. You had kind of resolved to pick a few targets that you wanted to go after the government, and you got yourself all set for the questions you wanted to ask. Then you saw the legislative docket and the legislation the government was proposing, and your chin hit the floor, and you said, "Oops! Throw those questions out. We got new, better ones." Is that kind of the way it went for you? A surprise agenda?
Oh, yeah, definitely. I mean, I think, we just had an election, so we figured that we would carry that conversation from the election forward, and we would be debating the best ways to fix healthcare, and we would be debating, how we were going to address the housing insecurity that so many Nova Scotians face and the cost of living, but we weren't talking about any of that. We were, as talking about, abilities to reduce oversight and introducing, lifting the bans on resource extraction, which you and I think, talked about a little bit last time. So certainly we did have to hit the ground running, but, as I was saying to you, Nova Scotians were not ready for this, and they weren't happy about it, and they made their voices heard. So our questions came right from the conversations that we were having from people in every corner of the province who said, "What the heck's going on in there? Because this isn't what we voted for."
Now, let me just play devil's advocate here. I don't have any pipeline to the Premier or anything like that. But, I think most of us, if not all of us, were surprised at the lopsided nature of the election. And in comes the Premier, who perhaps was looking forward to being the Premier again, and maybe even looking forward to a majority government again. But the supermajority government kind of changes things. And being the devil's advocate, is that not the appropriate time for a government to come in and say, we haven't touched the way we do business in the House for decades, and maybe it's time to modernize? What do you think about that?
Well, I think there's never an appropriate time to legislate without consulting Nova Scotians. I think there's never an appropriate time to reduce oversight, independent oversight, I should say, of the work of government and of the spending of Nova Scotians' money. And I think there's never an appropriate time to unilaterally and without any explanation do things like reduce protections for workers. So, I think absolutely Tim Houston has an agenda that he wants to carry out. But, I'll play devil's advocate to your devil's advocate, Bill, and I'll say, if you have a strong majority government, and that in our system that really means you can pass any legislation you want, why do you need to limit debate in order to do that? It really doesn't make any sense. Why wouldn't you use that opportunity to ensure that Nova Scotians have their say, knowing that you can implement your agenda no matter what? I think it was a short-sighted move, and I think it was one that shortchanged the voices of Nova Scotians.
Now, you wouldn't be aware of this, but we just finished an interview moments ago with the mayor of Cumberland County, Rod Gilroy, and the county council was responding to requests for support and letters from Minister John Lohr, specifically asking for support for that bill that would open up the door to energy exploration, mining, and fracking as a possibility. And most of the councils, I think, did not respond to the minister's letter with saying, yeah, go ahead, do whatever you want, because there are some great concerns, obviously. And the mayor of Cumberland just told us, in fact, that the likelihood of finding decent and approachable bodies or pools of natural gas in a fracking set, he said, is highly more in Cumberland than anywhere else in Nova Scotia. And, and he's, we've heard unanimously the town of Oxford, the town of Amherst, and the county of Cumberland saying, no thanks. Even if it's easier to get, even if there's more here, people are deathly afraid of opening that up, with the possible exception, of course, of those who might benefit financially from such an operation. But the mayor talked also about the extra tax on non-residents buying land in Nova Scotia. I think he said about 11% in a tax on the purchase and so on. And he's saying that only Cumberland County has the land connection with New Brunswick and the rest of Canada. And the flow of people, the flow of workers, the flow of cottagers, the flow back and forth with people living in Nova Scotia who have land, property, whatever, jobs in New Brunswick, and vice versa. Only Cumberland County would be adversely affected with an additional tax at a time when the premiers are trying to break down the barriers to interprovincial barriers. And so here's two pieces of legislation that Cumberland is really quite upset about, and you can talk to on a provincial basis, but really impacting the listeners here in Cumberland.
Well, it's interesting you say that, because I have spoken to a few folks in Cumberland County, and I think, these pieces of legislation do have different impacts in different places in the province, but they have a disproportionate impact in Cumberland County. I really think that they do, for the reasons that you outline. And, I think when we talk about free trade, that's an issue that's sort of academic for many Nova Scotians, but not for folks in Cumberland County, because you're at a border and you're the only ones. And you've seen what happens when things can move more easily or, with less ease over that border. So I think you're absolutely right. I think a lot of people thought that was short-sighted. I mean, that tax increase, this is their second kick at the can on this, and it wasn't popular the first time, and it wasn't popular the second time, and it does run counter to what we've heard around interprovincial trade. The amendment that we offered on that was, why don't you tax non-Canadians, right? Like, if you really need this revenue, and if we have a Team Canada approach, and that's what we need, we've had the Premier campaigning in Ontario for a good chunk of our legislative session here in Nova Scotia, then, why don't we look at, making it easier to do business and cross borders with our neighbors? And of course, your listeners would have a better sense of that. And, as we talked about before, I think that letter that the minister sent, seems like years ago now, but it was probably only a month, to municipal units asking for sort of preemptive agreement on any natural resource extraction without any details around what it was short-sighted and ill-conceived. And I think it was actually that kind of was compounded in insult by things like Bill 24, where they purported to take a whole bunch of municipal jurisdiction away without any consultation and then charge municipalities for whatever they decided to do. This government does not consult well, frankly, in my opinion, with anyone, but certainly has not been engaging municipalities and the Federation of Municipalities as the full partners and allies that they are and could be.
Notwithstanding the issues that you just addressed, but I opened the door on them, notwithstanding those, you had a lot to kick at in this legislative session. What was, and I'll use the word for you, what was the most egregious policy put forward by the Premier?
Well, it's hard to pick. I think the whole way of doing business, Bill, so, the fact that we had all these omnibus bills where the government kind of stuck a whole bunch of stuff together, didn't give Nova Scotians time to understand the legislation that was coming forward, which, as we talked about at the beginning, was a surprise anyway. I think that was pretty egregious, especially given, as we talked about, the capacity of this government, the knowledge that they had that they were going to be able to implement their agenda anyway. I think it was a really distasteful way of doing things. But certainly we heard from the public, and we saw that very first part of their very first bill, the first provision, which would have given themselves the power to fire the Auditor General without cause, was something, that Nova Scotians sat up and took notice of, because this is a government who spent more than $1 billion unbudgeted dollars every year that they've been in government. The Auditor General this year wouldn't sign off on their budget for the first time, in anyone's memory. The Auditor General gives a little, okay, in my opinion, this budget makes sense. Nova Scotians can rely on it. She wouldn't give them that opinion this year. This government has worked really hard to silence dissent, right? They've been divisive. So on the natural resource question that we talked about, you're with us or you're against us. And I think they saw the Auditor General, whose job is to represent all of us and hold the government to account on their spending, as, an enemy of some kind or as divisive. I think that was pretty egregious. And I think Nova Scotians did too, and they made their voices heard. And we're glad that they did.
Now, you've talked before about your concern that the government comes up with programs and spends money that were not in the budget per se. But in the end, of course, they would say, well, we did balance or at least improve on the deficit that we thought we were going to run. So, all things wash out. But your concern remains that they keep coming up with programs in midterm that they had not budgeted for. And maybe they've been only lucky that they haven't blown the deficit wide open. But I know that's been a concern of yours all along. And Tory Rushton is on this program every week, every Wednesday, and we spoke to him yesterday. I asked him about what he thought was a highlight from their perspective, and he said it's the first time that he can recall having members of the opposition vote in favor of the budget. Now, I don't know how many people that was or who they were, and it doesn't matter, but, that's an odd question because normally oppositions do not support the budget, and that's why you look for a majority of government in order to pass a budget in the first place. What's your perspective on that?
Well, the opposition member who voted for the budget was Elizabeth Smith McCrossin, and I'm sure she'd be happy to talk to you about her reasons for that. Certainly the rest of us felt like, as we've talked about, we weren't seeing the action on the issues that Nova Scotians need addressed. But, I think that this is another example of how this government just isn't really listening to Nova Scotians. We just haven't seen it. And, I think we just have so much further to go in that regard, Bill. Like, we need a Nova government that's listening. Tory Rushton is the minister, and it's under his watch that we're talking about fracking. I'm not sure the people of his constituency want that. I mean, he's an honest guy. I think he's doing his best. He's following the marching orders of this government. But we need a government that listens.
Now, I'll give you the same opportunity I gave him. Was there a highlight that you'd care to talk about in the session?
Yeah, well, I mean, the highlight for me really was the level of civic engagement. So, I think the news can be kind of dark right now. I think people are really worried about tariffs. I think people are worried about their economic future. I think, as you said, that government spending that we've been tracking, they keep making up these billion-dollar deficits. It's not likely they're going to be able to do that anymore by all financial forecasts. So I think people are concerned, and sometimes that concern can lead to apathy. People just get kind of paralyzed and depressed. And what we saw this session, I think, was really hopeful. We saw people engaging with the political process. We saw, I got really, I think it's a new record for emails and phone calls and letters from everyday Nova Scotians from all across this province, just expressing their opinion on the legislation in front of the House. And I know the government members got that too. And I think that's a highlight because, we're the birthplace of responsible government. We value our ability for Nova Scotians to engage. I think what Nova Scotians who did engage saw was that they had success. They were able to convince the government to change their mind on the things that mattered to them. And I think that's great news for the the health of our province.
A point well taken, but what bothers me is another example of you don't seem to get the sleepy public to wake up and offer any opinion until they're offended, until you do something they don't like. And wouldn't it be nice if you could get the public to once in a while give you a pat on the back or say, oh, well done, let's get behind this one and push together?
Well, I think we saw some of that. I mean, I think on interprovincial trade, I think that there definitely is a provincial feeling that's very widely held that we want to have a Team Nova Scotia approach and that we do need kind of collaboration as we think about that going forward. So I think there are pieces of that. That is, of course, also in response to a threat, but it's an external threat, at least in this case. But look, I think if government is doing its job really well, things are kind of quiet and sleepy because people's needs are being met and the job is being done without scandal or incident, and people can focus on the things they care about, their families, their communities, their jobs, their lives.
So what do you do when you get up? What's your day look like tomorrow?
What does my day look like tomorrow? There's lots of stuff at the end of a session where we review the things that we've been, the things that we've worked on, lots of emails to answer, lots of phone calls to answer, lots of meetings to have. But listen, I'm just getting right back on the road because the reality is that I'm not doing my job very well if I'm sitting in my office in Halifax. So, the next several weeks and months for me look like, getting to every corner of the province I can and talking to as many people as possible.